Good morning everyone and welcome to our remote meeting of the Police and Crime Panel. I'm Councillor Lucy Hovels, Chair of the panel. Please note this meeting is being broadcasted live to the Council's website and will be available to be viewed for a minimum of 6 months. I would like to give you a warm welcome to members, officers and any members of the public or media who are watching this live feed of the meeting. Before I commence with the formal business on the agenda, I would like to cover some housekeeping issues for us all to follow in order for the meeting to run efficiently as possible. For those participating in the meeting, if I could please ask you to only speak when invited to speak by myself as Chair. Keep your microphone on mute at all times unless invited to speak. If you wish to speak, please type RTS in the chat function and that will indicate to me that you wish to speak. Please bear in mind that all participants can see the messages in the chat function. Once invited to speak, please introduce yourself with your name and your position unless you have already introduced yourself earlier in the meeting. If I lose my connection, please note Councillor Jones, the Vice Chair of the panel, will take over in my absence until the connection is restored. Leads me straight on to the agenda. Item 1, apologies for absence.
We have no apologies, Chair.
Thank you, Ian. Can I move on to item 2, substitutes?
No substitute members, Chair.
Okay, now moves us on to item 3, minutes of the meeting held on the 16th of October 2020. Can we agree those minutes, please? Minutes agreed. Takes us on to item 4, which is declaration of interests. Has any member got any declaration of interest? I haven't been notified of any. Moves us on to item 5, media report. Do members have any questions or comments for this report?
Can I just ask, sorry Chair, through the minutes?
Yes.
With regards to matters arising, I asked at the last meeting about Checkpoint and the criteria for what people are using on Checkpoint, and I don't know if somebody said they were going to come back with a report. I know it's not on the agenda, but just to see what the criteria is for like sort of being allowed on Checkpoint.
Did anybody pick it up, or can we pick that up, Jonathan?
So Lucy, if I'm able to come in.
Sharon?
Yes, I did have a conversation with the Chief Constable following the last panel meeting where that was raised, and raised all the matters that were raised with me. In relation to Checkpoint, the whole disposals policy is being re-examined at the present time. I'm not able to provide an absolute position today, but we can ask the force to attend at a future meeting should that be desired.
Would you like it to be agenda for the next meeting, Councillor Boyce?
Yeah, I would, if possible, Chair, and maybe just keep it in the minutes so it's like a matters arising, if that's okay.
Okay, we'll make a note within the minutes and we'll make sure that's agenda for a meeting going forward. I'll go back to the agenda. I had no declarations of interest, which was item 4, and then moves us on to item 5, the media report, and we've got Lucy Constantine to present this report, I do believe.
Thank you, Chair.
Sorry,
Hi, sorry.
Lucy, I was going to, because it's 2 Lucys now, I was going to just introduce Lucy Constantine, new member of the team who joined us in December, has very quickly got to grips with the numerous responsibilities that she has, and we thought this was an ideal opportunity to introduce her to the panel and for her to present the report. Sorry, thanks.
That's great, and you're very welcome this morning, Lucy, and it's good having you on board. So I'll just hand straight over to you, Lucy.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Would you like me to present the report on our screen, or has everyone got that available to have a look at? Is that okay?
Yeah, I think everybody should have it within the minutes. and the
Okay, great.
papers.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, morning everyone. So the purpose of this media report that I've compiled provides an update on the press and social media coverage concerning the work of the Office of the Police Crime and Victims Commissioner since the previous meeting. And this goes into the press and media coverage that we've got from November through to January. And as you can see on the first bullet points in the press coverage, the top stories in the press and broadcast media for the last 3 months. We've done a lot of work around support for victims amid COVID delays, which was in relation to court delays, and what services there are for victims. Also, victims of domestic abuse, what services are still available in County Durham and Darlington. Work around the planned application for the new custody and investigation suite, as well as various case studies that have benefited from the funding from the office and what they've been able to do with the past couple of months. And also on the bullet points, if you scroll down, you can also see the consultation that we did for Precept, which was covered in local news. We set up some radio interviews as well across Metro and BBC Radio Tees, and we've detailed where the consultation has also been featured in local news as well. And I've also detailed some key publications there, which our coverage has been featured in over the last 3 months. And if we go into social media activity, as you can see, we've got Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram highlights here. So you can see our followers, where we are amongst other PCCs in the area. And if we just carry on to, we've got top tweets for top posts from November to January, from Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And here you can see the impressions. So impressions are the number of times that your content is shown on a social media feed. So it's the number of times people have seen a post. And you can see our top posts performing for Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and the reach of those impressions as well. So it's just interesting to see kind of what our top performing posts have been, and how many people have potentially reached and saw that content. And the columns, if we go into section 4, these are the monthly columns that Steve does write for various local papers, Durham Advertiser, Teesdale Mercury, and Weedale Community News. And as you can see, we've just detailed what the monthly news articles that he has spoke about recently and the content that was in them, including the impact of the pandemic, technology and policing, and more recently in January, the reflection of 2020, and our work with One Darlington magazine as well, and what content we'll be able to secure in there for the next couple of months. And yep, that comes to the end of my report. If you've please got any questions, do let me know.
Does any member of the board have any questions? Steve, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight a couple of things really. First of all, of course, in this continued and prolonged lockdown, of course, engagement with the public is not what it used to be. But I just wanted to emphasise, particularly around the Precept consultation, I'll talk a little bit more about the engagement that we've done at the next item, but certainly around the reach of BBC Tees and Metro Radio. We've tried this year to push the message out to as many people as possible around what I was proposing, and that's what I did in those interviews. Of course, what one can't do is actually analyse, how many people it reached and who were interested, apart from the daily figures that those shows have. But I would like to think that certainly we've covered as many bases as we possibly could to get the message out there, so that people are aware of what one is proposing. And Lucy's worked very hard on ensuring that, and also that there's been some very good media coverage around some of the good news stories around, particularly around the additional investment that I've been able to fund around the care of victims during this period, particularly around domestic abuse. And there's some good news stories, and I think we've done really quite well considering the circumstances and the amount of coverage that we've had. I just wanted to emphasise that. Thank you.
That's great. Can I ask the panel to note the information contained within the report? We happy? We'll move on to item 6, and it's the Police and Crime Commissioner's proposed precept. I've got Steve and Gary who'll do the presentation. At the end of the presentation, I will bring Camilla in.
Thanks very much, Lucy. And so how I'd like to run this is Gary, who is my chief finance officer, but also the assistant chief officer with responsibility for finance for the force. He's going to provide some context and some detail, and then I'll provide some detail around the engagement and my proposal, and essentially what it means in reality. So Gary, ready when you are. Are you going to share your screen on this one then, Gary?
Ian, have you got it ready, or shall I put it up? No, Gary, you've got presentation right, so you can put it up. Okay.
So Gary, if needed, I can share the presentation whilst you talk to it.
Okay, thank you, Sharon.
There we are.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Good morning. Nice to see you all again. Okay, just I'll speak for 5 or 10 minutes. Sorry, Lucy.
I said over to you, Gary.
Can you hear me?
Nice to see you as well. Okay.
Thank you, everybody. Just in terms of the budget, highlights of the budget: 1,206 officers in the coming year. That's the target which we've been set by the Home Office as part of the £20,000 additional police, 20,000 additional police officers.
Has anyone else lost Gary?
I think it's frozen. Yeah.
Normal retired officers.
Oh, Gary.
Gary, the year after that, we are being given funding for an additional. Sorry, Steve.
Gary, sorry, you're stuttering a lot. It might be best if, as beautiful as you are, to turn your video off to see if that increases the bandwidth.
Does that sound any better?
Yeah, that seems a bit better. Thanks.
Okay. Alternatively, shall I just quickly come out of the meeting and go back in? Yeah.
Give that a go, Gary. Yep.
Okay.
Give that a go.
Please bear with me.
So whilst we're filling time waiting for Gary to come back, when I start talking about investing in IT, perhaps that will resonate.
Hello, Lucy. Does that sound any better?
That's better.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your forbearance, everyone. Yes, so officers 1206, now 1274 in 12 months and 1364 the year after. Staff 1,240 staff, that includes 145 PCSOs. We expect to keep that constant. 2% precept rise is the assumption year after this one. Just lost the presentation.
Just lost the presentation.
Here we are. Pay rise, tax-based growth. This is something which has affected all local authorities, police and fire and rescue services. There's clearly less house building going on. I've spoken to colleagues in County Council and Darlington, and our assumption year after next is for a 0.75% growth in the tax base. That compares to a long trend over the last few years, about 1.5. Pay rise assumptions, 0 in the current year. That reflects the public sector pay freeze. 1.75% next year, then 2, then 2.5. That's in line with what other police forces down the country are expecting. Flat grant, what that means is the amount of government grant that we get isn't expected to increase. It hasn't increased over the last 2 or 3 years, and it's not increasing. It's not expected to increase in future, other than for the additional police officers which we're getting. That's the only additional grant that we're getting, nothing else. Nothing for additional pension costs, which are a big issue within policing service at the minute, and there's no other assumptions in there around any other investment other than what we're going to talk about. Next slide, please, Sharon. So in terms of capital, custody, about 21 and a bit million. Station improvements, 300 grand. What we do every year, I think I've said this on some of the consultations that we've had around custody, the broader estate. We spend about £300,000 a year investing in section offices. That's a real important aspect of visibility. £1.2 million a year for about 50 to 60 new police cars. We normally get 4 years out of a police vehicle in about 30-40,000 miles per year. ESN, that's the Emergency Services Network. This is the pocket handsets that all police officers carry. They are on very, very old technology. This is a national issue. And we're working, every force is working with 425, and we expect that to cost £4 million on the current prices. DEMS, this is our digital evidence management system. In simple terms, these are the body these days to video and film crimes and incidents. We only get 3 years life expectancy out of them, and we are having to put in £1.1 million every 3 years into the budget just to fund replacement of them. Finally, on the capital budget, we don't have any money allocated for the re-erection of the mast. Next slide, please, Sharon. So what it all means in terms of the future, in terms of the revenue budget, given where we are subject to the precept rise being agreed, we have a balanced financial position for the next 2 to 3 years, which I think is a good position to be in. I don't expect any significant reductions in officers and staff, for example, over the next couple of years. In fact, as I've said before, we will be growing them with the uplift. However, 24-25 and beyond, we start to get into revenue deficits, and these start to ratchet up. In relation to the capital budget, we have been funding the capital programme from a combination of reserves, some money out the revenue budget, and from some capital receipts as we've sold assets. And as you can see, we can also fund the capital budget for the next 2 or 3 years, but then we start to run out of cash. In reality, we do need to spend money every year on technology and police cars. If you don't replace the police cars, they just break down and end up being in the garage being repaired more, which costs you money either way. There's also a limit as to how much money we can borrow, or we can ask the Police and Crime Commissioner to borrow some capital for capital investment. This is a national issue which we're trying to work on centrally, and we're no different from any other police forces. We don't really have an answer for this. In terms of reserves, every council, fire and police force has to have some reserves for money for a rainy day. By the time we get to 3 years' time, we will have the minimum level of reserve recommended by our external auditor, which is £6.6 million. That represents 5% of the total revenue budget of the force, and all other reserves will have been exhausted by then. Next slide, please, Sharon. So in terms of efficiency, we have done some scenario planning around the future in terms of having to make expenditure reductions to balance budgets. We've made just over £1 million worth of efficiency savings for the 21-22 forthcoming budget. A lot of that relates to lessons from COVID, I think it's fair to say, and we're going to try and sustain that going forward, the learning. We do have an efficiency plan on a page. This is our performance management system for efficiency, which has been agreed by Steve as acting PC VC. We've also identified probably 6 or 7 key indicators to measure just how efficient the service is. Things like levels of sickness within the force. That's a good indicator of efficiency. Also, how quickly we respond to emergency incidents. We record that on a regular basis, and that gets analysed on a monthly basis by the top team in the force. That's something that we do know is very important to members of the public. We also have some secondary indicators of efficiency, things like levels of income generation that we do, levels of training of police officers that we do as well. And there's also a national efficiency group within the Home Office being set up, which I'm involved in for my sins. And the types of things we're looking at here as well is also social value. There's a lot of work going on at the minute around social value. There's a very good series of documents called Social Value Portal, and what we're going to be doing as a force going forward is any contract in excess of £100,000, we're going to write in a requirement for the successful bidder just to consider social value. And what I mean by that is things like local employment, employment of apprentices, employment of disabled people, employment of members of the community who are BAME, for ethnic minority and black, and also early payment of invoices to subcontractors. That's what we mean by social value. And finally, my final point is it's clear from the Home Office that there's a very high expectation on the service locally and nationally around efficiency. This is not going to go away. Hence my earlier slides around, yes, we can balance the budget for the next couple of years, which is a good place to be in terms of ongoing service delivery, but it does start to get more difficult in the future. Next slide, please, Sharon. So in terms of the deliverables, what it all means, the budget as proposed, we will deliver all of the police officers as indicated, 68 this year, with all ongoing costs that's associated with that, another 68 in the coming year. In actual fact, I expect us to have over recruited in the current year, which I think is a good thing, which I think Steve might want to touch upon. We're going to make sure that we are running with 0 vacancies in the coming year, subject to the precept being agreed. We have brought forward the current recruitment exercise for PCSOs. We normally recruit them in November, December. We are looking to recruit them in May, June this year. The closing date is now finished, and we've had 179 applicants who are local people within the county who in Darlington who want to come and work as PCSOs, which I think is great. We're keen to do that. We are looking to create some additional jobs around domestic abuse, which is a big challenge, as you all know. We are also looking to invest additional staff into cybercrime, which I think you've also had a briefing on as well. I've touched upon IT. Technology is a hungry beast, unfortunately, that we need to keep investing in, and we're also looking to invest additional people into the control room, so we're more speedy at dealing with investigations over the telephone, but only where that's appropriate to do so. Next slide, please, Sharon. Oh, that's the end. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you for giving me the time to speak for 10 minutes. At that point, more than happy to hand over to Steve or answer any questions colleagues may have.
Does any members have any questions so far? I'll bring Steve in.
Yeah, I was going to suggest, Lucy, if that's okay, because some of the questions might be answered in what I'm going to say, but then clearly at the end of my little bit, I would welcome questions from either myself or Gary. Essentially, I'll touch on a little bit more detail of what Gary has skated over. But first and foremost, I think I wanted to make the point that a lot of what Gary has spoken about, particularly in terms of looking forward, has been based on assumptions and best guesses. I think we all share a frustration also within local government that we have to go through a constant 12-month round of funding, which makes it extraordinarily difficult to really plan ahead, particularly for some big infrastructure projects, for example. And it just makes the task of looking ahead and being fiscally responsible that much harder. And I just wanted to re-emphasise that. I was on a meeting with the Police Minister yesterday, in fact, with fellow PCCs, at which the issue of funding formula and indeed budget settlements was raised, because we are in that realm at the moment. And you'll probably be aware that for some time the government has been looking to potentially look at the funding formula. There doesn't seem to be any appetite in the short term for that to change. So we are where we are. I think, ironically, everyone agrees that it's not a particularly good system, and yet it's something that we are stuck with. So I just wanted to add that caveat around sort of best case scenarios. And that's, I think, is important in terms of the context with which I talk to you today. And I said at the start of the meeting, perhaps before we started it formally, who would have thought that we would be still in this position this time this year when compared to last? And of course, everything that has gone before, no one could have predicted the situation that we were in, or indeed are in, both in terms of policing, but in terms of the wider economy. And that has been very much at the forefront of my mind, particularly in the position in which I find myself as an acting PCVC. I'm apolitical, as you know. And in terms of did I expect to be in this position for the second year running, then the answer is no. And so it's been a challenge in terms of trying to determine the best way forward. Now, I've said to the panel before, and indeed on my appointment as the acting PCVC, my guiding light has been essentially the raison d'etre for a PCC, which is around the provision of an efficient and effective force for the communities that we serve. And so I focus very firmly on that when considering the challenging fiscal circumstances that we find ourselves in. Now, of course, a very, very important part of my role is about engagement with our communities. And of course, that has been significantly stifled because of the conditions that we have found ourselves in over the past 12 months. However, I am pleased to demonstrate, and members of the panel that have been here for a while will know that I've been very keen on progressing the engagement agenda and being able to improve on that. And you will recall this time last year we had employed the services of an organisation to increase our engagement, and I'm glad to say that over the past 12 months it's been a continuous level of engagement, not just a one-off around precept, because it should be a continuous process. And over the past 12 months, using this new system, we've reached over 13,000 residents of County Durham and Darlington in terms of their views around local policing, in terms of their views around precept, in terms of their constant views around safety and well-being, and views around the force. And throughout the 12 months, it's been a really important tool for us to use in terms of tracking how people are feeling, particularly given the issues around COVID. I'm also pleased to say that my comms team, Simon Harm, isn't on the meeting, but in terms of the consultation around the precept, we've over doubled the number of people that have responded to our SurveyMonkey questionnaire. That's been through sort of paid advertising on social media to get more people engaged, and I hope that the interviews that I did on local media probably helped in signposting people to those responses. And whilst you've got some detail in that report, it's not entirely up to date because the consultation didn't close until the 31st of January. But it's essentially the figures around the engagement give an interesting picture, very different from last year, perhaps not surprising. And last year there was a very clear majority in relation to the proposal. This year we asked the question about whether people would be prepared to pay more to invest in local policing services. The results of which, at the conclusion of the survey, showed that the majority, I'm glad to say, said yes. So with 41% people said yes, 39% people said no, with 19% who said don't know. Whilst that's not perhaps an entirely clear-cut answer, to a certain extent that gave me some context in terms of looking at a more detailed question, which was about the levels that we were consulting on. And as you know, my proposal is for £15 for a bad deed property. When looking at that detailed question, 56% of people, of those who would be prepared, 56% of people overall would be prepared to pay additional money over and above what they're paying now. But drilling down into that detail, it's interesting that 13% would even pay more than £15 and up to £20, which I think is quite interesting. When considering the level of precept setting, clearly it's not just considering the burden on the local taxpayer, but that is clearly a very important factor for me, particularly given the context of the pandemic. But one of the things that we have to bear in mind, and it's why I spoke at the start of my report in relation to the funding formula that we have to deal with, is that whilst the government is clearly wishing to invest more in policing because they are funding the uplift of an additional 20,000 officers, of which we'll get 226. But one of the things that's important is that the announcement by government in December of an increasing settlement is wholly dependent on PCCs taking the opportunity to increase the precept by the maximum amount allowed. And it's important to recognise that any increase in precept for Durham will be the only increase for the force fiscally. The government grant is flat. The additional money that we get from the government is completely flat. So if we were not to increase the precept by any amount, we would in fact be going significantly backwards because of inflation and so on and so forth. And I think it's important to make that point. And of course, every force is different in terms of where the cut comes between government grant and what that looks like. So I think that's important to add that context. The other thing that I think is important to recognise is that in order to make the consultation relatively straightforward and meaningful, we have to pick a band and we have to pick a figure. So we picked on £1.25 per month increase for a band D property. That gives an additional £15 across the 12 months. That, of course, is significantly less for a band A and B property, and across the county and the borough, we've got around about 50% of our residents are in band A and B properties. The other thing to bear in mind is that, in fact, 20% of people across the county and borough actually don't have to pay any council tax at all because there's a complete rebate. All of those things have to be taken into context when considering the burden on the taxpayer, and I think it's important to make those points. So I just wanted to go on to provide a little bit more detail around, well, OK, if £15 is something that the panel agrees with, then what does that mean? And I think it's really important that whenever we spend public money, it's important to let people know what they're going to get for it. And so I think it's very important, and Gary touched on it in his presentation, that through my office and through discussions with the force, through that engagement that we've been doing throughout the year, we've been able to shape what the force is going to spend the additional funds on. It's not just business as usual, although most of the money does go on business as usual. It goes on making sure that when you pick up the phone that an officer comes out, or that you get the right level of service. But I'm acutely aware in the engagement that I've had over the past 12 months of some of the acute issues that people raise with me. And I'm glad to say that I've been very forthright with the force in saying if I'm going to increase and propose an increase of £15 for a Band D property, then we need to be honest with what that will provide. So Gary's spoken about the uplift and recruitment. Now, it's quite a complex process in terms of getting the money from central government, and there are very strict rules in terms of when the money's paid and so on and so forth. We are very keen to get to the additional numbers as quickly as we can. And so one of the effects of the increase means that we're able to be ahead of the game with the recruitment. And this is all about visibility. It's about having those officers to be able to respond to the concerns of the community. And so we reckon between 10 and 15 police officers, which effectively is a shift. It's an additional shift of officers that we will be able to have in place much quicker. And the other thing that the force is planning to do is some of the recruitment and the uplift is going to be done through transferees. It's not going to just be done through brand new officers. And of course, that means that we're going to have people, whilst they will be slightly more expensive, they are people who are fully trained and fully deployable on day one, as opposed to through training regimes across 2 and maybe 3 years, as it is now. So I think that's a highly effective use of the money. Gary touched on police community support officers. Of course, everywhere I go, particularly AAPs, I'm very encouraged to hear about how well received our police community support officers are and how they really do provide that cohesion across the community, and particularly that link between police officers and what we need to do and the visibility side of things. We are one of the few forces, as I'm sure you're aware, that retained police community support officers and didn't decrease that neighbourhood policing model through the difficult fiscal times that we've had over the past few years. And that additional money that we've been talking about means that we can accelerate the recruitment of police community support officers, not only to make sure that we don't carry vacancies. And in fact, you know, I often hear about, you know, this PCSO has moved on because they've joined the force and it's a real loss to the community, and now we've got a 3 or 4 month gap between when we get replacements. The money means we're going to be able to accelerate that recruitment process and make sure that we fill those gaps. The other important area that has been a highlight, particularly during lockdown, is in relation to domestic abuse. I've been able to invest commissioning monies to support our partners to provide additional support. But one of the important things that the force is going to do, if we have the money through this precept increase, is to recruit additional police staff to assist in the management of domestic abuse workloads. And that's really important. This is important work behind the scenes to make sure that the victims of these terrible situations and crimes really get the service that they deserve at a time when they most need it, and particularly during the pandemic. That has certainly come to the fore. Gary's touched on cybercrime. Again, the pandemic has really highlighted the issues with cybercrime and the vulnerabilities of some people when it comes to dealing with issues online. This isn't something that's unique to Durham by any stretch of the imagination, and it's something that the force across the country needs to invest in, and that's something that we need to look at. The other thing that is particularly important, and Gary again touched on it, is in relation to IT. And this is IT to enable visibility. I'm a great believer that IT is an enabler. It's not the answer to everything, but it certainly is an enabler. And if we can provide information technology to officers, that means they don't have to be tied to a desk and they don't have to be tied to a police station. That means that the amount of visibility that you get from those officers increases exponentially. And again, this stuff doesn't come cheap. Anybody who's recently changed their mobile phone and looked at the details of the contract and the amount of money it costs will realise that this kind of technology, whilst it's very effective, does not come cheap. The additional monies will mean that we're going to be able to accelerate the rollout of information technology to enable greater visibility. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, is about investment within our control room. The control room is the heartbeat of the organisation. Without that, we're pretty much nothing, to be brutally frank. And certainly over the past 12 months, the force has invested in additional staff within the control room, an increase of 7%, but it's not enough. And indeed, I believe that we're going to invite Chief Superintendent Johnny Blackwell to the next Police and Crime Panel meeting, and he's going to be able to talk to you in detail around what we're looking at doing. But I had a presentation from him several weeks ago at an executive board. The technology in the control room is perhaps not quite like you might see it on some fictional television shows. It's something that, to be brutally frank, is creaking across the country in terms of control room. And for us to stand still with the investment in technology and our ability to respond to people through the control room, we would have to spend £1.2 million. That's to stand still. I'm not interested in the control room standing still. I'm interested in them investing and getting better at what they do. And primarily that means about answering the phones, answering the online chat, answering that ability for us to communicate with people in new and innovative ways in order to be able to provide their service. And that is the other area in which this the increase in the precept will go towards providing. Now, there are 6 very specific areas which, if approved over the next 12 months, it will be the job of the Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner to hold the force to account for delivery of those things. And I certainly very much hope that this time next year, we'll be in a position, if my proposal is approved, to be able to say, this is where those deliverables are, this is where there's been improvement in service delivery, and this is where people are seeing what they get for their money. That's the sum total of the detail that I wanted to provide to you today. I'm happy to take, and indeed Gary's still on the line, any questions that you may have. But I'll just refer you to the formal paper and the recommendations that are on that paper, A to D, and I commend the report to the panel.
Yes, thank you, Steve, and thank you, Gary, for that very detailed information. And obviously, I'm going to bring Camilla in first. People have indicated they wish to ask some questions. In the order that they came in, it would be David Boyce and Councillor Wallace. But first of all, I'll ask Camilla, our legal advisor, to address the meeting.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Camilla Coulson-Patel, the Governance Solicitor, attending the meeting today. And what I wanted to do was just set out the position and for the precept report and the regulations before you go into your discussions on this report. So the regulations require that the Police Crime and Victims Commissioner notifies the panel of the proposed precept by the 1st of February. This has been completed. The panel have received the presentation and report of the acting PCVC on the proposed report precept today. It is a requirement of the panel to review and make a report to the PCVC on the proposed precept by the 8th of February 2021. The panel will also consider whether to veto the proposal. If there is no veto to the proposal, then the PCVC will have regard to the report and any recommendations made by the panel, respond to the panel, publish the response, and issue the proposed precept or a different precept if this is in accordance with the panel's recommendation. Today, the panel have been asked to consider a series of recommendations set out at page 15 of the reports pack, which is to note the current position of the consultation and expected outcome, to consider the proposal for a £15 precept increase at band D with the same percentage increase applied to all council tax bands as shown in paragraph 4 of the report, decide whether to veto the proposal of the acting PCVC and to produce a report. In relation to voting, with this being a virtual meeting, I wanted to take the opportunity to confirm the procedure to be adopted today. Members will consider the report and its recommendations with any questions of the panel to be put to the PCVC. Then there will be a proposer and a seconder of the recommendations, followed by a request for all those who are not in agreement to show dissent. Should there be dissent, we will move to a roll call. The PCP, the Police Crime Panel, may only veto the first proposed precept. If there is a veto, this must be agreed by 2/3 of the full membership, rather than just those in attendance today, which means that there would need to be 8 in agreement for a veto. Should the proposal be vetoed, I will advise the panel on the revised timescales and the next steps. Chair, that's just an outline of the procedure to be adopted today, with this being our first virtual meeting where we may have to move to a roll call vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Camilla. David, I'll bring you in first. You indicated first.
Right. Thank you. Can you hear me, Chair?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for those reports, Gary and Steve. First of all, trying to have a fully functioning force and just with a 12-month settlement is a thankless task, and I think under the circumstances you've done exceptionally well to come back with this sort of precept report. And I'm full of admiration for the amount of consultation you do. It can't be easy, and some of the comments that you've put down in the report are less than complimentary, but you still put them on. You still sort of pierce them on full force, which is admirable as far as I'm concerned. You mentioned that the fact that once you've done the consultation, it doesn't seem clear-cut support either way. And all the time I've been on this particular panel, I think this is probably the closest it's been. It isn't clear-cut, and I think that reflects the exceptional times we're living in at the moment. I think people are concerned about the raise in their sort of council tax as well as the police precept. I think people are concerned about the amount of money that's going to be spent on the custody suite, and I think people are struggling in County Durham, and yet we are expected to pay more and more on council tax precepts for parish councils and town councils, and one thing or another. So it is a very, very difficult times, and the fact that there's been a lot less police visibility on our streets during COVID, which again is understandable. So we're expecting to be supporting us to get more police, but we don't see as many police on the streets. So hopefully post-COVID we do see a lot more of police presence. And Steve did mention about the PCSOs that's going to get recruited, and that's going to go a long way to seeing PCSOs on the street. With regards to the cutting of costs, you did mention that there's in-force sort of efficiency drives. To me, getting 40,000 miles out of a car, high performance car, I'm sure we could be getting more if we looked into that. With regards with IT, maybe we could go with a less Rolls-Royce standard performance, but these are issues that's going to have to be held internally, I suppose. But all in all, I think you've done a fantastic job, and I would like to propose that we support the £15 increase that's been recommended by the acting PCVC. So I'm officially supporting that proposal.
Thank you, David. I'll bring in Councillor Wallace.
Thanks a lot, Lucy. I'd echo a lot of what David has said there, but I've got several questions, Stephen, if I may, and a point I'll make at the end. Firstly, you mentioned the need to have proper funding settlements and moving beyond the yearly settlement. Forgive my ignorance, is that the same thing as that we're going through in local government as far as waiting for fair funding, or is it a different process that the government is also stalling on, which is getting in the way of a fair settlement, both for the police and also for local authorities in Durham and Darlington? Secondly, as far as the statistics are concerned, do you have any analysis of who is responding to our statistics, because to our consultation? Because what we tend to know is that the people who are most likely to respond to consultation will be those who have, you know, good IT. Often they'll be quite well off, not always, but it's often the people who are most comfortably off who are most able to respond. And whilst it's encouraging to hear that some people would be prepared to pay more, I wonder how reflective of that is of people who are most struggling to pay. And that leads me on to my third point, which is I'm really struggling with this. In my ward, people on universal credit, the number of people on universal credit has gone up by 118% in the last 12 months, more than doubled. And that's reflected across Darlington, and I'm sure it will be the case in a lot of County Durham as well. I take the point that you make, that a lot of those people will be eligible for council tax rebate and therefore, you know, won't have to contribute. But there is a huge amount of increased poverty in our communities, people who are struggling to manage, and some of them won't get support. And I wonder whether this year is one when things are so difficult for so many families, we should be going to them, albeit for a relatively small amount, but whether we should be going for this extra amount, just as the government are expecting us to, you know, to put in our hands in our pockets for social care, for example, in a very unfair way. They're placing exactly the same burden as far as the police is concerned, and it's simply unfair. So my final question would be, if we don't support this increase at this meeting, Steve, what will be the impact on the budget? What areas will you be looking not to fund, or would you be in this exceptional year, would you be taking the money from balances as far as the balance reserves are concerned? So three points there, Lucy. Sorry I went on a bit, but if I could hear answers to those, Steve, I'd be really grateful.
Okay, I'll try and take them in the order that you've given them, Nick. In relation to the funding formula, I don't know the full details about local authority funding, but essentially it is down to the formulas that were produced, goodness knows, back in the day, how long ago, and the way in which, in terms of policing, the way in which things have very much changed. I think the funding formula on which we're currently funded was based on something in the late 70s, I think. Gary might know some more detail. But things have definitely moved on. The other thing that I wanted to make the point, even if they didn't change the funding formula, but just said you're going to decide on setting levels for the next 3 years, that would be an improvement of where we are. Having said that, the funding formula itself, for some forces, is fundamentally, fundamentally and blatantly unfair when you compare the funding of one force with another. That really, I suppose, only becomes relevant when you compare us with other forces. But I think an interesting, but not directly comparable statistic, when considering the precept rise, of course, I was interested to see what was happening around the country. And of course, whilst I'm apolitical, I operate in a political environment, and we have and should have local elections coming up soon. But needless to say, despite all of that, and despite the very real issues that you've raised around hardship and poverty, particularly as a result of the pandemic, that of course is reflected across the country. 70% of PCCs are proposing a maximum precept rise. And I go back to what I said at the start. If we do the only increase, and an increase shouldn't necessarily be the first thing that we always want. OK, I entirely accept that. And in a perfect world, we wouldn't always be looking at an increase, or at least not above inflation. But the reality is, in terms of the way that Durham is funded, the only increase that we can get, which includes inflationary increase, is through a precept increase. Now, we are, again, I don't want to make a political point at all, but the reality is that we are still coming out of a significant period of 10 years of reduced funding for the police service against a picture of increased demand. And you've got to square that circle somehow. And certainly in terms of the amount of investment that we are currently looking at within the force around information technology, it's really frustrating that we didn't do this 5 years ago. What is it that they say? When's the best time to plant a tree? 30 years ago. The second best time is now. And that's essentially that we've got within the force. We're very fortunate that we've been judged to being one of the most efficient and effective forces in the country. That doesn't come by accident, but we need to maintain that ability to innovate and to continue to provide the service that people need. And of course, the other thing, moving on to your point around affordability and poverty, is the sad fact of the matter is that when there is more poverty, when there is more financial hardship, the need for policing and the police service increases. It doesn't decrease. And whilst we're in a very peculiar situation with this lockdown, I have no doubt that as things are eased, things will become even more challenging for the service in terms of providing the level of service to people that is needed. Moving on to, and I've sort of covered off your second point there, I think, to a certain extent, but I wanted to speak about what if we didn't raise it by £15? What if we raised it by £10? And indeed, I've asked that question of the force. And the reality is this: the reality is that the cumulative loss, because of course, whilst we only deal in 1 year settlements, it has an impact. So whatever we don't increase it by this year then has a snowball effect, excuse the pun, particularly in this weather. And the reality is that we would look at potentially the loss of 30 PCSOs, so that's about 20%. We would potentially look at not being able to meet our targets around the number of police officers that we would have, because don't forget, the uplift only pays for their salaries. We've got to pay for everything else. We would probably have to hold police staff vacancies and potentially lose police staff vacancies, which at a time of significant fiscal, issues and job losses across the county, I don't think would be good. We would be looking at, and I take Councillor Boyce's points in terms of looking at the longevity of vehicles, but effectively that becomes a false economy if you lengthen the length of time you have them for, because you just spend you spend more time with the vehicles off the road being repaired than not, so we wouldn't be able to invest in that. We wouldn't be able to increase, and as you know, through the force estate strategy that is being revised, we've got an awful lot of aged policing estate out there that is literally falling down, and that's something that we are looking at over the next 2 years, and we need to look at. And then there are future pressures that we don't know about. I'm going to sound like Donald Rumsfeld now. We don't know what we don't know. And this time last year, we didn't know that we were going to be faced with a pandemic. The final point that I wanted to make, and again, it was linked to something that Councillor Boyce said, in submitting this proposal in this budget, I want to make it absolutely clear that through very careful fiscal management over the past 5 years, we're able to fund the investment in the custody suite completely separate to this proposal, which is why the proposal that I'm making, I've been very specific of what that will mean for service delivery across the force area. So yes, we could go for £10, but the snowball effect of that would be quite significant, and it's not something that I recommend. Was there another point that I missed? Sorry.
To forgive me, Chair, can I just come back on that? Firstly, there was the point about, do we know who's responding to our consultation?
Sorry. Yeah.
But the second point, Steve, I know Brian wants to come in as well. The second point was, can this year, and I appreciate the snowball point, we've been trapped in the same situation in Darlington ourselves, and I understand the advice, but is there not an option this year to take the money from reserves rather than make reductions, and you set them out very fairly, and thank you for that information. Is the reserves not an option in an exceptional circumstance this year?
Yeah, so just to answer that point, then I'll tell you about the who we're reaching with the engagement. You can only spend the reserves once, and once you've spent, they're gone. And as I said, if we funded the revenue from reserves this year, it's going to leave an even bigger hole in the reserves going forward. And as you saw in Gary's presentation, assuming the levels that I have proposed continue, by year 3, we're going to be in deficit. So if we use the reserves this year, we'll be in deficit a lot earlier. The other thing is that, of course, we've earmarked reserves for the custody project. Now, we could not spend the money on the custody project. That's £21 million. But that creates a whole Pandora's box of problems and significant risk for the force. Just going back to your question, and it's a really important question, Nick, around who are we reaching? And you're right, because, of course, in whatever engagement you do, it's really important to know who you're talking to. And this is why we engaged this organisation, Elucid. I don't think you were on the panel last year when we first started to use them. But one of the great things about the way in which Elucid engaged on our behalf is that we're able to target individuals demographically and geographically. Whilst we didn't around the precept consultation, if we wanted to only speak to people who lived in the city of Durham, we could do that using this system. Don't ask me how it works. It's down to algorithms and all sorts of weird and wonderful things. But one of the important things that they were able to demonstrate to us is one of the hardest communities for us to get to, probably at two ends of the spectrum, really. They're the very young and perhaps the very old. Certainly the very old, I would say that the best thing is face-to-face engagement. Of course, last year we had over 300 face-to-face engagements around the precept consultation alone, which was really important. We haven't been able to do that this year, and so that opportunity has been lost. But having said that, in terms of the engagement that we've had throughout the year through Elucid, and I'm just looking at the figures because I had the details sent through to me, we had engagement from more than 900 young people aged 18 to 34. Elucid class young people as 18 to 34. So, but 900 young people engaged, which are one of the hardest groups traditionally for people who, to be brutally frank, show an interest in local government and situations around local policing. So whilst I would like to improve on that, the other thing that was important, we've had more than 300 non-white respondents across the course of the year, which, given the demographic of diversity in County Durham and Darlington, is not bad. But at least we know. Whereas before, people responded, they answered questions, and we simply didn't know who they were, where they were from, their ethnicity, their age, or anything. So this system actually provides us with some really important data on which we can continue to grow. Thank you.
I've got Councillor John Nicholson, and then I've got Councillor Brian Jones. John,
can I just come in, Chair, just on that particular point that Steve's just said, just a point of clarity, if that's okay.
Right, okay, David.
Just when you mentioned what I said about the custody suite not coming out of this year's precept, I know that I've heard this report enough. I'm just saying what was being said on the streets and people saying and people struggling. So I just wanted that minute, and that I do know that the custody suite improvements is not coming out of this year's precept. Thank you.
Okay.
I wasn't suggesting you didn't know, David, but I just wanted.
And I don't want to stray off in there. I'll come back. Councillor John Nicholson.
Councillor John Nicholson, Anfield Plain Division. I sit at the sharp end, and I've just had this conversation this morning. You know, I'm seeing on average 100 people a week attending food banks, various kinds of food banks, and these people are both working but struggling. And this is my greatest worry, that the PCC are looking for an increase, the county council will be looking for an increase, my parish councils asked for an increase, and they're the people that we're going to push over the edge, and that's the point that I'm struggling with. I see the sharp end. I cannot weigh them up. I cannot. And if there was a way we can reduce the amount we're asking for, then I'd be more than happy with that. I'm really struggling to support this. Really struggling.
Okay, I'll move on then to Councillor Brian Jones.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Before I go to the subject matter, can I say I had an email from Derek Dudwell about half an hour ago. He's totally unable to get logged into the meeting and asks if he can give his apologies, please.
That's Derek.
Yes.
I think he's with us now. I think things probably moved on. He's joined the meeting. I have got him in the meeting, and I have got him registered to speak.
Okay, that clarifies that, Chair. Thank you. Chair, I understand the points made by the previous speakers with regard to those who are struggling, but I can't help but think if you ask the ordinary man or woman in the street, I'm not talking about the keyboard warriors now, they want an efficient police force. In Steve's own words, they want to get the service they deserve when they need it, and that doesn't just apply to those who are suffering from domestic violence. Everybody wants the best police service they can get, and to deny this rise, we all have to pay it the same as everybody else. I think it would be wrong. I think the system is wrong in terms of how it's allocated, because County Durham and Darlington have, I guess, more Class A and Class B banned properties than the likes of Surrey or Hampshire. And I know that, being a member of the fire service, the rise in the precept for Durham can result in a difference of something like £15 million compared to the southern counties because of the value of the properties. But based on those few things, I would like to formally second the motion put forward by Councillor Boyce, Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Jones. I have got Derek in the meeting, and Derek, did you want to contribute to the discussion?
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I'm glad to get, I don't know what went wrong, and neither do I know how I managed to get in the meeting eventually anyway, but that's beside the point. It's my ignorance on it. Can I just say, whilst I sympathise with the arguments with regard to the increase, the biggest mistake I ever made in business was post 9/11, when, in support of the airline industry that was struggling, we froze our fees for a year. The problems that created year on year after that were unbelievable, and as such, I've always maintained, even if you've got to keep your increases going year on year, otherwise you never ever catch up, and I support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. And I've got the last one, Pauline, Councillor Craythorne.
Yeah, I agree with everything what you've said. I really sympathise with people are really struggling. But I think a lot, Steve, is if you put out in the public domain exactly what you're spending this money on, where it's going to go and how it's going to benefit the community with extra police, and we're going to see them on the streets and next to the PCSOs, I think people just look at £15 and they think they're not getting anything for it. I think if you explain more to the public where it was going and you're not getting any funding from the government, I think people appreciate it more. It's basically all I've got to say.
Thank you for the comments, Councillor Craythorne. I have got Councillor Dulston who's indicated to speak, and then we will come back to Camilla, and we will be I'll be asking to go to a vote. Councillor Dunstan.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I just want to echo what Councillor Boyce has said around us being able to differentiate that this money isn't being spent for the custody suite, because residents I speak to will see that we're asking the taxpayer to fund this investment into a new custody provision. And I also echo what Councillor Wallace says in the fact that, you know, is there scope for us to use some of the reserves to counter the increase that you're proposing? And I say that because, you know, the custody suite is still controversial. We know that the political candidates from both Labour and the Conservative have pressed for the decision to be delayed. Whatever decision they'll make in the future, we don't know. But certainly if it was delayed, then that reserve, some of the reserves could counter the gap that you're experiencing. So that's really just my commentary, but again, struggling to where to go with it, unfortunately.
Lucy, can I come back on a couple of points?
You can, but then I will have to take some advice from Camilla and make sure that we've gone through the correct procedure in terms of the vote. Steve, you've got the right to reply to Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you. So I really, just to echo the comments that I've already made in response to Nick's question, reserves can only be spent once, and that doesn't resolve the ongoing revenue issues. That if you get behind once, this is essentially what Derek was saying, then it's very difficult to catch up. And I absolutely accept that nobody likes to see tax increases, but I think it's really important to recognise that in terms of the recovery coming out of the pandemic, policing is going to have to be at the forefront of that. If we think that the situation is as bad as it's likely to get from a policing perspective now, then I'm sorry that I don't see that. I think that the recovery is going to be really quite significant in terms of the demand on policing. And the ability for Durham to be able to respond to that is reliant on our ability to be able to invest in the right places. I absolutely want to make that point very strongly. And I know that we don't want to get dragged into a conversation in relation to custody, but I must make this point. If we don't invest in the custody centre as proposed, we will have to do it in another way, which is likely to be much more expensive. And that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. Well, the report has been moved by Councillor Boyce, and it's been seconded by Councillor Brian Jones. And I'll come to you now, Camilla, because obviously the report's been moved and seconded, but we do need to have a vote on it. What I would ask before we go to that, and because I know you'll want to do the roll call, is there anybody against that recommendation that's being put forward? No? So, Camilla, do you want to do the roll? Sorry,
Yes,
Councillor Wallace, do you want to?
Yes, I think for clarity, because there has been, we had proposed if there would be sort of general agreement to this, then we would have just taken it as read, that everybody was in agreement and there would be no veto on the proposal. But given the comments that have been raised and that it has been proposed and seconded, we'll move to a roll call. As I've already set out, we need 2/3 in support of a veto for a veto to take effect. So I will go through the list of members, and if you can bear with me while I do that, and if you can confirm whether you're in agreement with the proposed precept. So firstly, Councillor Boyce.
So you say Boyce?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm for the proposal.
Councillor Pauline Craythorne.
For the proposal.
Councillor Lucy Hovels.
For the proposal.
Councillor Nicholson.
Against the proposal.
Councillor Quinn.
For the proposal.
Councillor Savoury.
For the proposal.
Councillor Simmons.
For the proposal.
Councillor Dalston.
Against.
Councillor Brian Jones.
For.
Councillor Wallace.
Against.
And we have Mr. Cook.
For.
And Mr. Dodwell.
For the proposal.
Thank you. Chair, we have 3 members who are against the proposal, which is beneath the threshold to be able to veto the proposal. So the proposal is as stands and that is passed.
Okay, so the recommendation is to agree the proposal and moves us really on to the next agenda item, which is item 7, which is, before I move on, we will be confirming that in writing, and that will be sent up to the Commissioner's office with a short report from what's happened at this meeting. And that will be done with myself and the legal advisor, and that will be sent off hopefully following this meeting.
Thank you, Lucy, and I just wanted to thank the panel for their consideration and to give some reassurance that the comments that have been made are I totally take on board. But thank you. Cheers.
Thank you, and can I thank members as well for the comments and the what's been discussed this morning. Takes us on to item 7, which is the quarterly performance report. And can I ask James Atkinson, who's with us within the meeting and from the PCV office, to present the report?
Thank you, Chair.
Welcome, James.
Thank you, Chair. I'm the Scrutiny and Accountability Officer for the OPCVC. This quarter's quarterly performance report focuses upon key performance questions 1 to 4 and the outcomes 1 to 2. I am mindful that it's a relatively long report, and I'm just going to pull out some of the key performance themes over the last quarter. So straight into outcome 1, communities are safe and crime is reduced. For the key performance question number 1, how safe are our communities? I would just like to direct panel members to point number 9, which states around the that the total volume of crime across Durham's Force area has dipped to its lowest point in 23 months as of March 2020. This then increased up until July 2020, and after a steady decline, after which a steady decline was noticeable in the total volume, which dropped to uncommonly low levels in November and December 2020. So this appears to be linked to the impact of the local and national lockdown measures in response to the COVID-19 crisis. With regards to antisocial behaviour under this key performance question, ASB incident levels have been above those recorded in previous years. There was a significant spike from March to April 2020 of around 50.9%, that increase. This can be attributed in part to the lockdown measures, and is then likely that levels have remained comparatively high even after the first lockdown was lifted, due to typical summer spikes in ASB levels. So after that, after the summer period, we have since seen these levels return to relatively typical levels. They're currently sitting very similarly to what was seen in January 2020, pre-COVID. With regards to road safety, and point numbers 17 and 18, as shown in figure 8, serious road casualties saw an unprecedented reduction in 2020, predominantly due to the significantly reduced road traffic on our roads in light of the COVID-19 lockdown measures. Notwithstanding this drop, Durham Constabulary and the OPCVC continue to seek ways in which to tackle the rise in serious casualties for road users. And in 2019, in 2019, the PCVC contributed to a community speedwatch van, the first of its kind in the country, for Crook, which was match funded by the Area Action Partnerships and Durham Constabulary. And this project now has a commissioning agreement in place to extend it to the Dale, so that's Teesdale and Weardale. Moving on to neighbourhood policing teams, point number 20, the role of neighbourhood policing teams and PCSOs are a core part of the core of our policing model in Durham Constabulary. Although some adaptation has been required due to the COVID-19 crisis, a recent peer review of the neighbourhood policing team in Durham identified best practice in rural neighbourhood policing teams, specifically regarding engagement, use of technology, and ensuring that the hard to reach rural communities are included And a recent ambition of the neighbourhood policing teams in the force is that this will be replicated in those rural fringes that are on the cusp of the urban areas, which, you know, just to give a bit of context to that, that is typically sort of in the east, you know, around those more urban areas, those rural fringes. Moving on to key performance question 2, how well are we preventing and reducing crime? So I would direct members to look at the Criminal Justice Partnership section, points 26 and 27. The Criminal Justice Partnership has raised concerns that more crimes being detected will impact on local delivery of other criminal justice services. So, for example, probation and the CPS and things like that. And this situation has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis and the pressures that have arrived with that. During the pandemic, the closure of courts and the subsequent need for social distancing has resulted in significant backlogs in a number of cases being heard throughout the courts, which local partners have been working to relieve the situation. The backlog in the magistrates' courts has been cleared, and there's ongoing work to manage the numbers in the Crown Court, which have reduced in Durham but remain significant. But with regard to how Durham are performing in the national picture, we are doing comparatively well. The further lockdown period may have an impact on this, although services are more prepared to manage the situation going forward. It's probably also worth mentioning that additional funding has been provided by the Ministry of Justice for victim support services, which has obviously further enabled the OPCVC to ensure that victims of crime can be helped both remotely and face-to-face where necessary. This moves us on to outcome 2, victims and the vulnerable feel supported. And key performance question 3, how well are victims supported to cope and recover and engage in criminal justice processes? So around the criminal justice and the LCJP, the Local Criminal Justice Partnership. Sorry about this, my computer's just frozen. Can everyone still hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Just the Word document is okay. Right. Performance management within the LCJP. So the main point to direct their members to here is that the Victims Code of Practice has recently been updated, and the PCVC has a responsibility to measure compliance with this across agencies, and all the there is a plethora of background work ongoing to ensure that that is done as effectively and efficiently as possible. With regard to victim care services, point number 33 and figure number 10 tell us that even over the COVID-19 period, referrals made into the VCAS service via the police have been gradually increasing, which is particularly interesting as it has bucked the trend for some of the other services and also for general crime levels. So the rationale behind the sharper rises seen in that reporting avenue over the last 2 quarters are linked to the rollout of the new Red Sigma system and the increased focus on officers completing victim contact contracts. So that is in a fashion a good news story to see those referrals increasing, and they've also increased in appropriateness. With regard to victim satisfaction and experience, point number 39, there have been decreases since the last quarter in 2 out of 6 satisfaction categories, which is whole experience and treatment. And there have been increases in 3 categories: ease of contact, actions taken and follow-up received. It's worth noting that the satisfaction levels remain within typical fluctuation patterns. There is nothing atypical that we've seen even over the COVID period regarding victim satisfaction levels. This moves us on to key performance question number 4. How well are vulnerable people supported with regard to modern slavery? And point number 44, as a result of participation in both national and regional modern slavery and human trafficking networks, a modern slavery statement has been published, and this has been done in partnership with 6 neighbouring police forces and PCCs, and the statement outlines the commitment and intended actions in terms of addressing modern slavery and human trafficking, and that's through business activities and supply chains and other things such as that. And it's probably important to mention as well that this is going to be underpinned by a local delivery plan, which is currently being reviewed and updated. And this brings us on to our final section of the report, which is mental health. Probably the biggest thing here to pull out is that there is an overall year-to-date increase in the number of under 18s detained under Section 136 of the Mental Health Act, who have been then taken to a health-based place of safety. So this was 9 have been detained in the year-to-date between April and November compared to 1 the previous year. So this does suggest an increased demand for places of safety in relation to where Section 136 place of safety. That brings me to the end of my report, Chair. I would like to hand you over to Steve White and Sharon Cadell to take any questions on the report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, James. I have got some questions from members. Councillor Savory, you had your hand up first. I'll take Anita first.
Thank you, Chair. It's just, can I declare an interest on the police speed watch vehicle within Weardale, because I'm involved in that project and I have put funding into it. So just for clarity, can I declare an interest, please?
Okay, we make sure that's recorded in the minutes, Anita.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, and a very good scheme. Very welcome. I've heard a lot about it. Moves us on. David, Councillor Boyce, do you have a question?
Yeah, I've got a couple of points, Chair. Thanks for that report, James. It was better when you kept on going through which item you were actually talking about, so we could sort of keep up when you're just going through the highlights. But it was a very detailed report. Can I just ask about point 8 on page 29, where you put it reported crime and the way it's been recorded? I thought this was an issue that we dealt with years ago. This is when we used to discuss things with Ron Hogg, that I thought there was sort of harmony across the forces now by the way it's recorded. And is it down to the way it's recorded in regards to what's been reported, or is it down to what goes through the court or admittance of guilt? Because if we're not reporting things the same way across the forces now, after all these years, how on earth can we compare and contrast how we do? And, you know, I thought all this was sorted out. And the other point I want to make is with regards to the last issue with mental health issues, and a lot of people who's got drug and alcohol issues coming into mental health, how we think having the public health budget taken away from the council next year is going to affect, because that's going to be £21 million that was going towards local initiatives to help people with mental health issues as a result of drugs and alcohol, how that's going to affect us on a crime level. Just there's my 2 points, Chair.
Thank you, David. Steve, do you want to come in?
Yeah, just on the first point, David, I share your frustration. You're absolutely right. And indeed, in the dim, distant past, as an operational cop, when the Home Office originally wanted to try and harmonise the way in which forces recorded crime details many years ago, I have to say that we still haven't got to a point across the country where we are measuring like for like, in that every force records things in the same way, despite the plethora of rules and standards that there are now. The most recent high profile example of that perhaps was in Greater Manchester, where you've seen a whole plethora of incidents and crimes that haven't been apparently properly recorded. On the positive side of things, Durham is really good at it. So and that's one of the reasons why we're shown to be an efficient and effective force. But of course, because we're really good at it, sometimes our figures can look a little bit skewed because of it. I make no apologies for that, because one of the most important things in policing is, if we are going to deal with issues and with crimes, we've got to know about it. Just pretending it doesn't exist or not recording it doesn't help anybody. So it's to a certain extent a double-edged sword. But I'm certainly happy and convinced that the chief leads a force that is at the top end of performance in terms of properly recording crime. But I do know that this is something that we need to have a proper narrative around. And I've had a brief conversation online with Councillor Dalston around this very same issue. And it's something that quite possibly we could ask the chief to come and talk to you about at a future meeting. In relation to your second point, David, I share your concerns. It's not just about money in relation to alcohol and drug abuse, of course, and the effect it has on crime. But of course, it is worrying that if a huge proportion of the budget is not going to be there, then the amount of support that people have is going to be reduced, and that is something of concern.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I've got Sharon Kittet.
Yeah, I've withdrawn. I was going to make a comment there, but no need now, thanks.
Thank you. And takes us on to the recommendation, which is to note the report. Can we note the report? And can we move on to item 8, which is the commissioning update? And Charles Oakley from the office will present the report.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Charles Oakley, Head of Governance and Finance in the PCC's office. The commissioning report is a record of the decisions and discussions that we've had at the commissioning board since the last police and crime panel. I just invite the members to ask any questions or clarifications on the document. I'd be happy to answer them.
Member have any questions or comments they want to make? If not, can we note the report?
Sorry, Lucy,
Steve? Yeah.
Could I just say something? I just wanted to say, in terms of the commissioning activity from the office, there's lots of good news in there in terms of the way in which we're able to support our partners and schemes going forward. And I just wanted to make that point, really.
I think it's an important point because everything's done in partnership. We can't, and I always say police is everybody's business, and obviously the work that we do within the councils is as well. And we've got some great examples of partnership work and joint funded projects, and that has got to be really celebrated across the county and within Darton as well. So with that, are we happy to note the report? Okay, we move on to item 9, which is the decision record, Steve. And I've got Sharon down for this one.
Thank you, Lucy. Just to properly introduce myself, I'm the Interim Chief Executive and Monitoring Officer. So this is a standing agenda item and just bring to you an update in respect of key decisions that have been made and recorded within the Office of the PCVC. Hopefully everybody will have read the report, and I think you will be familiar with the requirements to record significant decisions and for those to be monitored and appropriately scrutinised by statutory officers such as myself and Gary Ridley, who's on the call with us today. As the report sets out, clearly every effort is made to hold public meetings in line with our commitment around transparency. However, policing is a fast-moving world at times, as is crime and things that happen in respect of victims as well, and community safety. So sometimes there are requirements for key decisions to be made outside of key meeting processes such as our executive board. Nevertheless, all decisions are captured, and the appendix, if I can move you on to appendix 2, details a record of all decisions that have been taken and recorded. Those are all published on our website in line with legal requirements. And these are all the decisions that have been made since we last met as the Police and Crime Panel. I'm happy to take any questions, and my recommendation is for partners to accept, for panel members to accept the report.
Does any member have any questions or comments you want to make? No. So we ask for the report to be noted, and it moves us on to item 10, the Joint Independent Audit Committee report. And Sharon, are you going to address this one?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So again, this follows on quite neatly from the last agenda item in relation to our transparency commitments. And this is a report in relation to consultancy services that have been procured by ourselves or by the constabulary, that we thought it was timely and appropriate to share with the panel. Again, Chair, hopefully the report is clear in relation to its content, and sets out very clearly kind of the use of consultancy services. I am happy to take any questions that members have upon the report, and otherwise my recommendation would be for panel members to consider and accept the report.
Any member have any questions or comments? It's been none indicated. Can we agree the recommendation? Been agreed. So moves us on to item 11, complaints update. Camilla.
Thank you, Chair. This is the update for the complaints that have been received in relation to the PCVC. Members will recall that at the meeting on the 16th of October, the panel reviewed and agreed an update to the procedure for dealing with complaints and conduct about the PCVC, and where appointed their deputy. The updates to the procedure were made following recommendations from the Local Government Association on best practice for complaints handling. I can confirm that a copy of the updated procedure is available on the Durham County Council website and is available on request. Members may note that there has been a slight change in the formatting of the procedure, simply for presentation purposes to ensure that it complies with accessibility laws. There's been no change to the content, it's simply a change in the presentation, and this is to ensure that the procedure is accessible to those who use assistive technology, such as screen readers. It was also agreed on the 16th of October that there would be an update on any complaints which have been received, and this was to promote transparency and ensure effective scrutiny by the panel. And it's to consider formal complaints that have been received, including those which have not been presented to the panel. I can report that between the 16th of October 2020 and the 27th of January 2021, at the time of writing this report, there were no formal complaints received in accordance with the procedure. Chair, the recommendation is simply to note the report.
Thank you, Camilla. Can we note the report? And it takes us on to the next item agenda, which is the HMIC FRS inspections. James, are you going to present the report?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So the report is just to be noted by the panel, and the detail around it is that the most recent HMIC FRS inspection report that the PCC has been requested to comment upon is an inspection of the National Crime Agency's relationship with regional organised crime units. The inspection focused upon current capability, resource and alignment with the serious and organised crime strategy and the National Strategic Assessment, the ability to provide single authoritative strategic assessment of the threat from serious and organised crime and compliance with national intelligence standards and existing legislation. Those are the main themes of the inspection. The inspection was not Durham specific, it was a national general inspection of predominantly the National Crime Agency, and the PCCs were asked to comment in relation to collaboration predominantly, and it's just to note that the PCVC accepts the force's response to the recommendations in relation to that inspection. With regard to future inspections, we have the pre-charge bail and released under investigation striking a balance report, which we are required to respond to as well, and worked ongoing to do that. And also, just for panel members to note that the force is currently preparing for a 2020 peel inspection as well. That concludes my report.
Thank you, James. Does any member have any questions or comments you want to make? Can we agree the recommendations? been agreed takes us on to item 13, any other business? I have not been notified of any other business, so that would conclude the business for the public part of the meeting. And before the broadcast ends, I would like to thank those members of the public and the media who have watched this meeting. Could all members please ensure their microphones are on mute until we have received confirmation that the live broadcast has ended. We will then move into the private part of the meeting, which is second meeting invited were sent. The broadcast recording ends after about 30-40 seconds, and the IT broadcaster will then join the meeting to confirm that the recording has ended.